The evening was bright with golden lights, crystal chandeliers hanging high above, casting a warm glow across the grand hall. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume, mixed with the subtle aroma of fresh flowers placed in every corner. Every detail in the room screamed wealth and elegance: polished marble floors, velvet curtains, and tables set with sparkling glassware and silver cutlery. The crowd inside was dressed in their finest, men in tailored suits, women in flowing gowns, diamonds catching the light at every turn. Conversation flowed like a river, polite laughter blending with soft music playing in the background. This was the kind of event where appearances mattered more than anything else, a place where people measured each other by wealth, status, and influence. In the midst of all this grandeur, she entered quietly. Unlike the others, she didn't walk with confidence or demand attention. Her steps were slow, careful, almost hesitant. She wore simple clothes, modest and plain, a soft color that didn't clash with the rich surroundings but didn't stand out either. Her shoes were clean but not flashy, her hair tied neatly but without any elaborate styling. At first glance, no one noticed her. She didn't smile or try to make small talk. She didn't laugh at the jokes floating around the room. She moved like someone who didn't belong, someone who had stepped into a world that was not hers. No one paid her much attention. Some passing glances barely lingered before the eyes moved on to something more entertaining. A few thought she might be a member of the staff or a guest who had been invited quietly. There was no sense of importance about her, no air of wealth or arrogance. She carried herself simply, as if the grandeur around her didn't matter. But there was something about her presence, subtle, quiet, that seemed to slightly disturb the flow of the room. Though no one could quite put their finger on it, she walked slowly toward a corner where a grand piano stood. It was an impressive instrument, black and polished so much that it reflected the chandeliers above. It had been waiting for hours, prepared for a professional performer who was supposed to entertain the wealthy guests tonight. The piano had a kind of silent authority in the room, a promise of music that would match the elegance and sophistication of the evening. The crowd had been expecting someone well-known, someone trained in the highest classical traditions, someone whose presence alone would impress them. But the person meant to play was nowhere to be seen, and the guests had begun to murmur, some checking their watches, others glancing impatiently at the empty piano. She approached slowly, her eyes fixed on the piano. Her hands rested gently on the keys, almost reverently. She didn't announce herself. She didn't seek permission, though it seemed no one stopped her. Some people whispered among themselves, wondering if she was part of the staff or a last-minute replacement. A few chuckled quietly, assuming she would probably embarrass herself. After all, this was a room filled with critics, people who measured talent by appearances, people who believed they could tell a gifted performer at first glance. They had no reason to believe that someone so plain, so quiet, could command attention in a room like this. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not touching them yet. The room felt heavier, as if holding its breath. She was calm, almost serene, and that calmness stood in stark contrast to the murmurs of curiosity and the whispers of doubt from the crowd. The silence of her approach was unusual in a place like this. People were used to being loud, to making themselves seen, to being noticed. Yet here she was, silent, unobtrusive, and yet somehow impossible to ignore completely. The organizers of the event looked at her with confusion. They had no instructions for this moment, no idea who she was or why she was stepping up to the piano. A small exchange of looks passed between them, uncertainty written on their faces. Should they stop her? Should they ask her to leave? But before any of that could happen, she sat down on the piano bench with a kind of quiet dignity that demanded attention in itself. She adjusted the seat slightly, straightened her back, and took a deep, steadying breath. She didn't look around the room. She didn't react to the whispers or the doubtful glances. Her focus was entirely on the piano in front of her. The room, still buzzing with the expectation of someone famous arriving, started to notice the stillness she brought. A few heads turned fully toward her, curiosity mixing with skepticism. Some of the wealthy guests leaned slightly forward in their chairs, thinking they might get a little entertainment out of this. perhaps a poor attempt at music they could laugh at afterward. They didn't know she had been preparing for this moment silently, away from the eyes of anyone who might judge her prematurely. They didn't know the countless hours she had spent practicing in secret, the sacrifices she had made just to reach a moment like this. To them, she was just a quiet, unassuming figure who might entertain their amusement for a few minutes. As she rested her hands lightly on the keys, a hush fell over the room. Not the kind of respectful hush reserved for great performances, but a curious, uncertain hush, the kind of silence that comes when people are trying to decide whether to ignore something or pay attention. Some held their breath, almost involuntarily, sensing something unusual. Others whispered quietly to their neighbors, guessing at her identity or imagining what kind of performance might come next. The room was full of anticipation, though no one knew why. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if centering herself. The air seemed to vibrate with possibility, a quiet tension that made every small movement she made noticeable. Her hands lifted just slightly above the keys, and the first touch promised a story, one that the audience could not yet hear but somehow began to feel. It was subtle, yet the sense of something about to happen was palpable. Even the air seemed to change around her, the frivolity and chatter of the wealthy crowd beginning to fade into background noise, replaced by something more intimate, more human, more real. No one spoke. No one moved. The grand hall, filled with riches and luxury, suddenly felt different. The presence of this quiet, simple woman had shifted the atmosphere. She hadn't played a note yet, and still the room was attentive. The wealthy guests, who were used to commanding attention with their words, their wealth or their status, were now experiencing something they weren't used to, an attention that wasn't demanded by noise or display, but earned silently, purely through presence and focus. She opened her eyes and looked down at the keys, not with arrogance or fear, but with a quiet confidence born of practice, passion, and dedication. The room waited, still unsure, still skeptical, but undeniably drawn in. They didn't know it yet, but this moment would change the evening completely. It wasn't about who was wealthy or powerful or famous. It was about music, human emotion, and the connection between someone who had something real to say, and a room that had no choice but to listen, even before she touched the keys. She had captured the room's attention. The wealthy crowd, who had been judging her before she even began, now leaned forward slightly, unsure what they would hear, but unable to look away. The stage was set, the moment was ready, and all eyes were on her, the quiet woman who had walked into a world of grandeur without a hint of fear or pretension. She was ready to tell a story through her music, a story that would reach far beyond appearances, far beyond wealth, far beyond judgment, and in that silence, that waiting moment, the audience felt it, the electricity of something extraordinary about to happen. The room held its breath, unknowingly aware that this unassuming woman would soon transform their world, even if only for a few moments. The grand piano waited. The first note was about to sound, and no one, not a single person in the room, would ever forget what happened next. The room buzzed with whispers as she sat at the piano, her fingers hovering just above the keys. The wealthy guests exchanged glances, unsure what to make of her. Some leaned back in their chairs, smiling with amusement, convinced that this quiet, unassuming woman could never fill the grand hall with music. Others nudged their neighbors, whispering guesses about who she might be: a forgotten student, a member of the staff, someone who had wandered in by accident. No one suspected that what was about to happen would leave them speechless. The scheduled performer had not arrived, and the organizers were starting to fidget. They had expected a polished, well-known musician who could impress the audience with ease. Instead, here was someone completely unexpected, quietly taking her place. A few of the event staff exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to intervene. But there was something in her calm posture, her steady focus, that made even them hesitate. It was as if she had a quiet authority, the kind that doesn't shout, but makes people stop and listen. A group of guests at one table snickered quietly. "Do you think she even knows how to play?" One whispered, trying to hide her laughter behind a hand. "Looks like she's about to embarrass herself," another replied. They leaned forward, curious, ready to enjoy a moment of mockery at her expense. Wealthy or not, they all loved a little drama, especially when it involved someone they underestimated. She didn't respond. She didn't smile, and she didn't react. She simply placed her fingers lightly on the keys, taking a moment as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The room seemed to pause, the soft hum of chatter fading, replaced by an almost tangible tension. People began to notice the quietness of her presence. It wasn't loud or demanding, but it was impossible to ignore. Her stillness alone created anticipation, as if the entire hall was holding its breath. Finally, she pressed the first key. A single, soft note filled the space. It was gentle, almost delicate, and yet it carried a strange weight, a feeling of something deeply personal, a story waiting to be told. The guests leaned forward, some in surprise, others in curiosity. The sound was so different from what they expected, not flashy or showy, but real and honest. The soft tones seemed to reach out to each person individually, touching something they didn't realize they were missing. She continued, her hands moving slowly at first, carefully, deliberately. The music was subtle, tender, like a whisper in a crowded room. It didn't scream for attention, but it demanded it in its own quiet way. Slowly, the crowd began to sense that this was no ordinary performance. The laughter and whispers that had filled the room moments ago faded. Even the most skeptical guests stopped talking. Captivated by the unexpected beauty emerging from the piano, some people looked around nervously, unsure whether to react. They had been ready to mock, to find amusement in her supposed failure, but the music left them speechless. They realized that their assumptions were wrong. This quiet woman was not just capable, she was extraordinary. The notes she played carried emotion, depth, and a power that was impossible to ignore. Each key pressed seemed to tell a story, each chord reached into the heart of the room. Leaving the audience stunned, the music grew stronger, more confident. She didn't rush. She didn't play for applause or recognition. She played for herself, and in doing so she touched everyone else. The wealthy guests who were used to controlling every situation with money or influence had no control here. They couldn't dictate how they felt. They couldn't predict the notes, the rhythms, or the emotions. All they could do was listen. And they were completely unprepared for the feelings that washed over them. A few guests felt a lump in their throat. The melody seemed to speak of loss, of struggle, of quiet strength and resilience. They didn't know her story yet, but the music made them feel it. Some looked around, noticing others with tear-filled eyes or trembling hands. This was not just entertainment, it was something much deeper. The hall, once filled with chatter and superficial appearances, was now transformed. It felt smaller, more intimate, as if the music had drawn everyone closer together. At one corner, a man who had been quietly observing from the beginning frowned in disbelief. He had assumed she was inexperienced, someone to be ignored. But now, with each note, he felt a strange mixture of surprise and admiration. He could see it in the faces of the others, too, a growing realization that they were witnessing something truly rare. The music was not just skilled. It was alive, as if it had a pulse, a heartbeat of its own. The grand piano, which had been just an elegant piece of furniture moments ago, had become a storyteller. As she was the voice guiding it, the tempo of the piece changed gradually, building tension, then releasing it, drawing the audience deeper into the story. Each note was purposeful, each pause meaningful. The wealthy guests, who had expected polished performance but little soul, now felt exposed. They realized that their assumptions about appearances, about who belonged and who didn't, were meaningless here. Talent, emotion, and dedication could not be faked or bought. They were seeing that truth with their own eyes, hearing it with their own ears. Some of the younger guests leaned in, forgetting their previous amusement. They were mesmerized, unable to look away. A few older guests, usually reserved and critical, had their hands resting lightly on their hearts, feeling emotions they hadn't felt in years. The room was filled with something impossible to name. A shared sense of awe, of respect, and of quiet wonder. The laughter that had once echoed through the hall was gone. Replaced by an almost sacred silence, the woman at the piano remained focused, never once glancing up. She didn't play to impress. She played to express. She didn't need approval or recognition. The audience, however, could not help but respond. Their eyes followed every movement of her fingers. They noticed the subtle shifts in her posture, the way she breathed with the music, the gentle expressions that passed across her face. Even though she had walked in quietly and unnoticed, she now held the entire room's attention completely. A group of organizers exchanged wide-eyed glances. They had expected chaos, complaints, or an embarrassed end to this unexpected moment. Instead, they witnessed a transformation. The energy in the hall had changed. The crowd that had arrived with vanity and judgment now listened with humility and curiosity. The woman had quietly commanded respect without a word, without a gesture, without a display. Her skill, her emotion, and her sincerity had done it all. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Each chord she played seemed to resonate with something personal in the audience. Some felt sorrow, some felt hope, and some felt inspiration. They didn't know her story, and she hadn't told it, but the music conveyed it in a way that words never could. By the time the first section of her performance ended, the room was utterly silent. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly, as if afraid to break the spell she had created. Then, almost imperceptibly, a slow, soft clap began. One guest, hesitant at first, allowed their hands to meet in quiet applause. Soon others joined, the sound growing steadily until the hall was filled with the warmth of recognition. The applause was different from the polite clapping at previous performances. It was genuine, heartfelt, and spontaneous. The wealthy guests who had once doubted her skill now felt compelled to celebrate it. They had witnessed something remarkable, something unexpected, and they could not hide their admiration, even as the applause continued. She remained seated at the piano, a quiet figure in the midst of the excitement. She didn't smile broadly, nor did she rise to take a bow. Her satisfaction was subtle, private, a simple acknowledgement of the connection she had just made with the audience. She had come quietly into a room that had underestimated her. And now, without arrogance or display, she had captured everyone's attention, proving that talent and sincerity always shine through. No matter the circumstances, the wealthy guests, who had arrived expecting entertainment, were now experiencing something much deeper. They were learning a lesson about humility, about judging others too quickly, and about the unexpected power of quiet determination. The room was still filled with applause, but it carried a different meaning now: respect, admiration, and a recognition of something truly extraordinary in front of them. As she finished this section of her performance, the room seemed to breathe collectively. No one spoke at first, as if the experience had left them slightly awed, even shaken. They had entered the hall expecting luxury and superficial charm. Instead, they had been touched by something real, something human, something that could not be bought or faked. And all of it had started with a quiet, unnoticed woman walking toward a grand piano, ready to play from the heart. For the first time, the wealthy guests realized that appearances could be deceiving. Quietness, simplicity, and modesty were not weaknesses. They were often the cover for extraordinary ability, for talent that could leave a room speechless and hearts changed. And as she prepared to continue, no one in the hall could have imagined just how far her music would reach, or how deeply it would resonate with each person present. The first part of her performance had left the room in awe, but it was only the beginning. She took a brief pause, her fingers hovering above the keys, eyes closed for a moment, as if listening to a melody only she could hear. The wealthy guests leaned forward in their seats, still stunned, unsure whether to expect more or to remain in silent admiration. Some whispered to each other, still processing what they had just heard. A few shook their heads in disbelief. The simple woman they had ignored and underestimated had already transformed the entire atmosphere of the room. She opened her eyes and began again, this time with more confidence, more purpose. The music started softly, almost like a conversation with the audience, but gradually it grew stronger. Her fingers moved over the keys with precision, each note deliberate and full of emotion. The melodies seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside her, carrying not just skill, but her heart, her story, and her soul. It was no longer just about the piano. It was about every person in the room feeling something they had not felt in years. Some of the guests felt goosebumps as the music flowed over them. They had attended countless events like this, seen many performances, but none had moved them this way. There was no pretense here, no showiness or flash. There was honesty, and that honesty struck them harder than any grand gesture ever could. Even those who were skeptical at first could not help but lean in, drawn to the purity of her music. They had come expecting entertainment, but they were experiencing something far more profound. A connection. As the melody continued, it grew more complex. Her fingers danced across the keys with a skill that seemed effortless, yet every note was filled with meaning. The music carried a story of struggle and triumph, of quiet resilience, of the kind of determination that comes from overcoming obstacles no one else can see. The wealthy crowd, so used to judging by appearances and measuring worth in money and status, began to understand that there was more to life than what they could see on the surface. Talent, dedication, and heart mattered far more than they had imagined. Some guests felt their hearts ache with emotions they could not name. The music spoke of loss, of hardship, and of dreams that had seemed impossible. Others felt hope, a quiet reassurance that strength and perseverance could change everything. Every person in the room was feeling something different, yet all were connected through the sound of her music. They realized that in that moment, wealth, status, and judgment were meaningless. What mattered was what came from the heart. And her heart was speaking through the piano. A few people tried to hide their emotions, brushing tears from their eyes or straightening in their chairs to compose themselves. They were unprepared for this experience. The room had been filled with chatter and laughter before she began, but now even the most talkative guests were silent. Every head was turned toward her, every eye fixed on the piano. She didn't need to speak to them. The music said everything. It told of struggles they had never faced, of victories they could never fully understand. Yet it made them feel them deeply. The music built to a crescendo, filling the grand hall with sound that seemed to vibrate through the marble floors and high ceilings. Her hands moved faster now, more urgently, yet every note remained perfect, controlled, and full of life. The wealthy guests watched, mouths slightly open, unable to look away. Some felt their hearts race, others felt tears stream silently down their faces. The music had become alive, almost like a conversation between her and the audience, each note a word. Each chord a sentence that told a story more powerful than any speech. Even the event organizers, who had been anxious and unsure about allowing her to play, were completely absorbed. They had expected a minor distraction, maybe an awkward performance, but instead they were witnessing something extraordinary. They whispered to each other, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. "I didn't think she could do this," one murmured. "Neither did I," replied the other. The words hung in the air, full of astonishment and respect. As the crescendo reached its peak, the room felt as if it were holding its breath. The audience could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. And then, without warning, the music softened again, gentle and flowing, almost like a whisper after a storm. Her fingers moved delicately over the keys, producing notes that seemed to touch the deepest corners of everyone's heart. The wealthy guests, who had been so quick to judge her, now understood that they had been wrong. She was not just skilled. She was exceptional, a true artist. A few guests began to glance around at one another, realizing that they were sharing a rare experience. Some dabbed at their eyes, trying to hide the emotions they had not expected to feel. Others simply sat, letting the music wash over them, feeling its power without needing to analyze or understand it. The woman at the piano had created something magical, a moment that transcended wealth, status, and even words. As she continued to play, the melody became more expressive, more alive. The audience could hear the story of someone who had faced challenges quietly, who had endured hardship, who had fought against odds that no one else could see. They didn't need to know her past, but they felt it through her music. The notes were honest and human, and that honesty touched each listener differently. Some felt sadness, others felt joy, and many felt a mixture of both. The wealthy guests, who had come to the event expecting entertainment, were now completely transformed. They had been reminded that true talent is not about appearances, about wealth, or about recognition. True talent is about heart, about dedication, about being able to touch others in a way that words cannot. They had been humbled, silently, by the music of a woman they had ignored when she first walked into the room. Her hands moved effortlessly over the piano, her expression serene but focused. She didn't play for applause, for praise, or for anyone's approval. She played for the music itself, for the story it could tell, and for the connection it could create. And in doing so, she had captured every person in the room completely. There was no distraction, no pretense, only the pure, undeniable power of her talent. A few moments passed in this way, the music flowing and the audience completely absorbed. Some of the wealthy guests who had been skeptical at first felt a wave of shame for having underestimated her. They realized that their judgments, based on appearances and status, had been shallow and unfair. And yet, they were grateful for the lesson, grateful to be witnessing something so real, so human, and so profoundly moving. The music began to change again, rising to another crescendo. This time, it was not just skill or precision that impressed the audience. It was the emotion, the depth, the story behind every note. Her fingers flew across the keys, but never carelessly. Every movement had intention, every sound had meaning. The wealthy guests were captivated, unable to blink, unable to look away. The room was no longer just a place for socializing and showing off wealth. It had become a theater of emotion, of human connection, of artistry that could not be ignored. As the final notes of this section lingered in the air, the room remained silent for a heartbeat longer. No one moved. No one spoke. The audience was stunned, not by extravagance, but by something far more powerful: authenticity, talent, and emotion. They had come expecting entertainment, but they had received an experience that would stay with them long after the night was over. Finally, a soft murmur of appreciation began to spread through the room. Guests exchanged glances, some nodding to one another in silent acknowledgement of what they had witnessed. A few whispered words of astonishment, barely audible over the fading notes of the piano. And yet, even as the murmurs grew, the sense of awe remained. They were not clapping yet, not because they didn't appreciate her, but because the experience had been too overwhelming, too profound to respond immediately. The woman at the piano remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her eyes closed again for a moment. She was calm, centered, and composed, as if the storm of emotion she had just created was simply part of what she did. The wealthy guests, who had been so sure of their judgment just moments ago, now understood that she was in a league far beyond their expectations. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price, a mixture of awe, respect, and wonder. In that room filled with wealth and luxury, something much more valuable had been revealed: the power of genuine talent, of quiet confidence, and of human connection. And as she prepared to continue, everyone present knew that the performance was far from over, and that the next moments would only deepen the impact of what they were witnessing. The quiet woman who had walked in unnoticed was not just playing the piano. She was telling a story that would leave the wealthy crowd forever changed. The music had already captivated the audience, but now something deeper was about to unfold. She leaned slightly forward, her fingers poised over the keys, and the hall seemed to hold its breath. The first part of her performance had drawn curiosity. The second had inspired awe, but now the energy in the room shifted to something almost sacred. Every guest, wealthy and powerful as they were, had stopped thinking about status, luxury, or appearance. All they could focus on was the sound, the story, and the emotion coming from the piano. She began again, this time with a strength that seemed to come from her very soul. The notes were louder, richer, more complex. Her hands flew over the keys with precision, yet there was a fluidity to her playing that made it feel natural, effortless, and alive. Every chord, every melody carried emotion that no one in the room had expected. Some of the guests felt their hearts tighten as the music reached deep inside them. It was more than skill. It was honesty, vulnerability, and passion all at once. A few guests had tears forming in their eyes. They hadn't expected to feel anything so strongly in a room filled with wealth and luxury. They had come for polite entertainment, a little music to fill the evening, and perhaps a chance to impress others with their knowledge of the arts. Instead, they were being confronted with raw, human emotion that they could not escape. The wealthy crowd, usually so composed and controlled, was slowly being humbled by the authenticity of her performance. She played with intensity now, yet she never lost control. Each note was deliberate, each movement purposeful. The melody told a story of struggle, of heartbreak, of quiet courage, and of triumph against odds that no one else could see. The audience could feel it without needing to understand the details. It was as if she was speaking directly to each person in the room, reaching past all their social barriers, past their assumptions, straight to their hearts. Some of the wealthiest guests, who had spent years accumulating power and influence, suddenly felt powerless in the face of her music. They had been prepared to judge, to scoff, or even to dismiss her entirely. Now they sat in silence, listening, feeling, and experiencing something they had never anticipated. Their laughter, their confidence, their superiority, all of it had vanished. The music was bigger than appearances, bigger than status, and bigger than any expectations they had ever held. The tempo shifted, now alternating between moments of urgency and moments of gentle reflection. Her fingers moved with speed and accuracy, then slowed, almost tenderly, as though every note had been chosen to convey a specific emotion. The crowd was spellbound. Every subtle pause, every gentle touch of the keys, drew them further into the story. They began to understand that this performance was not just music. It was an expression of life itself. The struggles, the victories, the pain, and the joy. Some guests whispered softly to each other, trying to process what they were hearing. "Have you ever heard anything like this?" one asked. "No," another replied, eyes wide, voice trembling slightly. "It's incredible. She's extraordinary." But even as they spoke, they knew words were failing them. The music was beyond description. It reached deeper than any conversation, beyond the reach of any compliment. It was alive, human, and impossible to ignore. The wealthy crowd, often so focused on appearances, found themselves in a rare state of humility. They couldn't fake their emotions, couldn't pretend to be unimpressed. They were human, and her music reminded them of that. Some felt nostalgia, some felt sorrow, some felt a bittersweet happiness. Each person experienced the performance differently, yet all were united in awe and admiration. The grand hall, once a place of status and luxury, had become a sanctuary of emotion and connection. Her hands moved with remarkable speed and precision, yet there was no sense of haste. Every note seemed measured, intentional, as though she were telling a story that required exact timing and expression. The crescendo built again, filling every corner of the room, vibrating against the marble floors and high ceilings. The wealthy guests leaned forward, held in place by the force of the music. It was as if the piano itself had become a living being, breathing and speaking, telling a story that no one else could tell. Some guests could no longer hold back their emotions. Tears ran freely down faces that had been carefully composed just moments before. Others had their hands pressed lightly against their chests, feeling the depth of what they were experiencing. They realized that they were not simply watching a performance, they were witnessing a human truth. A raw and undeniable talent that reached beyond wealth, status, and appearance. Even the organizers, who had once been unsure of letting her play, were fully absorbed. Their earlier doubts seemed trivial now. They watched as she commanded the attention of a room filled with the elite, not with arrogance, not with words, but with music that spoke directly to the soul. They whispered to each other, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. "She's remarkable," one said. "Absolutely remarkable," agreed the other dot. As the performance reached its peak, the music became almost overwhelming. The notes soared and dipped, rushing and then lingering, telling a story that had no words but carried infinite meaning. The audience could feel every emotion she poured into the piano. It was a story of hardship, of perseverance, of hidden strength, and of courage that could not be measured by wealth or power. Each chord struck a chord in the hearts of everyone listening. Some of the wealthy guests, who had been used to control and influence, now felt a humility they had rarely experienced. They were reminded that talent, heart, and emotion were forces that could not be bought or commanded. They had been challenged unexpectedly to set aside their judgments and simply feel. And in doing so, they discovered something profoundly moving. The music softened briefly, almost like a quiet sigh, giving the audience a moment to breathe. But even in that softness, there was power. The gentle notes carried vulnerability, courage, and honesty. The crowd felt connected to her, to the piano, and to each other in a way that no one had expected. The wealthy, who often measured everything by appearances, could no longer see the barriers between them. In that hall, filled with elegance and luxury, all that mattered was the human connection created by a simple, honest performance. As she continued, the music swelled again, louder and more commanding than before. The room vibrated with energy, and even those who had tried to hide their emotions found themselves moved. Some clutched the edges of their chairs, others pressed their hands to their hearts. Every note she played seemed to reach inside them, stirring feelings long forgotten or buried beneath the trappings of wealth and status. A few guests whispered in disbelief, struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. She's incredible," one murmured. "I've never heard anything like this," said another. But their words could not capture the depth of the experience. The music was beyond speech, beyond judgment. It existed purely to touch hearts, and it had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Finally, the crescendo reached its climax. Her hands moved with lightning speed, but each note was clear, precise, and full of feeling. The room seemed to vibrate with the power of the music, as if every person present were holding their breath together. And then, as suddenly as it had grown, the music softened once more, leaving a lingering silence that was almost more powerful than the sound itself. The wealthy guests were frozen in place. They had been captivated, moved, and humbled in ways they had not expected. The music had shown them a truth that could not be ignored. Talent, heart, and emotion were far more powerful than wealth, status, or appearance. They had come to the event for entertainment, and yet they had received something far greater, a lesson in humanity, connection, and the power of quiet determination. She remained at the piano, her hands lightly resting on the keys, her expression calm yet focused. She didn't need to acknowledge the audience with words or gestures. The impact of her performance spoke louder than any applause. The wealthy crowd, who had underestimated her from the moment she walked in, were now in awe. They had been forced to confront their assumptions, to feel deeply, and to recognize the power of someone who dared to rise above expectations quietly but confidently. In that room, filled with grandeur and wealth, something much more valuable had been revealed. Talent, sincerity, and courage were forces that could touch anyone, regardless of status or background. And as she prepared for the final moments of her performance, the audience knew that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a story told not with words, but with music, heart, and soul. The final notes of her performance lingered in the grand hall, soft and trembling like a heartbeat slowly fading into silence. The room remained still for a long moment. No one moved. No one spoke. The wealthy guests, who had come expecting entertainment, were instead caught in a moment of awe that seemed impossible to break. It was as if time had paused, holding its breath along with everyone present. The music had told a story far greater than anyone had imagined, a story of struggle, perseverance, quiet strength, and the extraordinary power of talent. Then, slowly, one guest clapped. It was soft at first, hesitant, almost as if they were testing whether anyone else would join. But soon another clap followed, and then another, each one gaining strength. Within moments, the applause grew into a roar of admiration, filling the room with a sound more powerful than any music. The wealthy guests, who had once judged her for her simple appearance, now stood in genuine respect and awe. They clapped not just for the skill they had witnessed, but for the courage, the heart, and the honesty she had poured into every note. She remained seated at the piano, calm and composed, her hands resting gently on the keys. She didn't rise immediately. She didn't bow dramatically. There was no need for words or gestures to explain what had just happened. Her music had already spoken louder than any introduction or applause ever could. The audience's admiration was real, heartfelt, and unmistakable. They were no longer the same people who had laughed or whispered doubts when she first approached the piano. Something inside them had changed, a quiet recognition that talent and heart could not be ignored. No matter how modest the person who possessed them, a few of the wealthiest guests approached her cautiously, their expressions a mixture of awe and curiosity. They wanted to know who she was, where she had come from, and how someone so unassuming could play with such mastery. Whispers spread through the room as people shared what they had seen and felt. "She's incredible," one said. "I've never heard anything like that," replied another. Even the organizers, who had been uncertain about letting her perform, looked on with amazement, realizing that she had not just filled the hall with music, she had filled it with emotion, with humanity, and with a story that everyone felt but few could articulate. Finally, she rose from the piano bench, standing quietly before the audience. Her movements were simple, unassuming, but every eye remained fixed on her. She had walked into the hall unnoticed, underestimated, and now she stood at the center of attention, not because she had demanded it, but because she had earned it. The silence that followed her rising was different from the earlier stillness. It was respectful, filled with the acknowledgement of her talent and the impact she had made. Someone in the audience finally spoke aloud, breaking the silence. Who are you?" Their voice trembled slightly, betraying their disbelief. Others echoed the question, eager to know the story behind the woman who had transformed their evening so completely. She smiled faintly, a quiet, serene smile, and for the first time, she spoke in a gentle voice that carried throughout the hall. She told them a little of her journey, a story of dedication, of secret practice in small rooms far from notice, of challenges faced quietly and overcome without recognition. She spoke of moments of doubt and moments of triumph, of the long hours she had spent learning, and of the passion that had driven her to this very moment. The audience listened, rapt. Every word she spoke added depth to the experience they had just witnessed. They realized that her music had been shaped by her life, by her struggles and victories, by her resilience and determination. The applause that had erupted moments before grew even louder, this time not just for the performance but for the story behind it. People were standing now, clapping, some with tears in their eyes, some with expressions of astonishment and respect. They had come expecting music, but they had received something far more powerful, a lesson in perseverance, humility, and the extraordinary strength of quiet determination. Several guests approached her after the performance, eager to express their admiration. Some shook her hand, others simply bowed their heads in respect. They spoke words of encouragement, astonishment, and gratitude. "I have never experienced anything like that," one said. "You've reminded us all of what really matters," said another. She accepted their words with quiet dignity, responding with gratitude, but never boasting. She did not need to. Her music, her story, and her presence had already spoken for her. The wealthy guests, who had initially overlooked her, were now humbled. They realized that their judgments, based on appearances and assumptions, had been shallow and unfair. In witnessing her talent and hearing her story, they understood something profound. True greatness is not always visible at first glance. It cannot be measured by status, wealth, or outward appearance. It is revealed through dedication, heart, and the courage to pursue one's passion. Even when no one is watching, the organizers of the event were also transformed by the experience. They had worried that allowing her to perform might create awkwardness or embarrassment. Instead, they had witnessed a performance that would be remembered for years to come. The music had transcended the boundaries of the room, touching the hearts of everyone present. It was a reminder that true art and true human connection cannot be predicted, controlled, or bought. As she began to step away from the piano, a few guests called out, urging her to return for an encore. She paused, looking at the audience with a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said softly, but I think the story is complete for tonight." Her humility only added to the admiration they felt. The crowd understood that she had given everything she could in that performance, and that was more than enough. She had shared her heart, her talent, and her story, and the impact would remain with them long after the evening ended. The wealthy guests, who had arrived expecting to impress and be entertained, left the hall profoundly affected. They were no longer thinking about status, appearance, or superficial accomplishments. Instead, they reflected on what they had witnessed: the quiet power of talent, the value of dedication, and the incredible impact of someone who pursued their passion with honesty and heart. The woman who had entered unnoticed had left them forever changed, reminding them that true greatness is often found in the most unexpected places. In the days that followed, people could not stop talking about the performance. Guests shared stories of the quiet woman who had walked into a room of the wealthy and silenced them all with her piano. They spoke of the music that had touched their hearts, the humility and courage she had shown, and the lesson they had learned about assumptions and the true meaning of talent. Her story spread beyond that one evening, inspiring others to recognize the extraordinary and unexpected places and to value the power of dedication, perseverance, and heart. She had arrived quietly, underestimated, and almost ignored. But in the span of a few moments she had transformed an entire room, touched countless hearts, and left a legacy that could not be measured in applause or accolades. She had reminded everyone that talent and passion are not always loud, that true greatness often comes quietly, and that the impact of sincerity and skill can reach far beyond what anyone expects. As she walked away from the piano, the wealthy guests remained standing, still clapping, still absorbing the weight of what had just happened. The hall had returned to its normal lighting, the chandeliers sparkling as before, but the energy was different. It was no longer a room of simple luxury or status. It was a room that had been touched by humanity, by art, and by the quiet strength of one determined individual. And so, she disappeared quietly, just as she had arrived, leaving the room transformed and the wealthy audience forever aware that true talent, heart, and courage can never be underestimated. They had witnessed a performance that would remain in their memory forever, not just for the music, but for the story it told, the emotion it conveyed, and the reminder that greatness is often found where it is least expected. The story of that night spread quietly but steadily. People spoke of the woman who had walked into a grand hall without fanfare, who had captured their attention, and who had reminded them of something they had forgotten: that passion, dedication, and authenticity can move hearts and change lives. The room had been filled with awe, admiration, and respect, and the echoes of her music lingered in the minds of those who had been fortunate enough to witness it. In the end, it was not about applause, recognition, or wealth. It was about connection, emotion, and the quiet power of someone who dared to pursue their passion and share it fully with the world. And in that quiet, powerful way, she had left a mark that no one would ever forget.